All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start with our audio of our new novel, Prisoner B-3087 by Alan Gratz. Before you get into it, I know you don't have a physical book. It makes it a little weird and different. But normally, if we were meeting together in class, we would talk about, checking out the book cover and looking at everything that's on it. And we talked about the walls of the ghettos that were built in the city. So they basically imprisoned people in the cities, how they were built out of brick and different things. And here on the front of the book, you see a young boy, it looks like, and he's looking up over these really tall walls. And at the top of the walls, you see 4 or 5 strands of barbed wire into a gray and cloudy sky. And there's another image of barbed wire. So just think about what you see on the cover of that book and the mood and the tone it creates. Alan Gratz has written a lot of books that you might be interested in reading. And here's a little blurb of the reviews if you want to look at that later. Title page, it says that it is based on a true story by Ruth and Jack Gruner, which means it is really historical fiction, but it's based on a true story. So what fictionalizes it is that the author, Alan Gratz, he adds in a few other historical characters and historical places so that we can learn about them. Many of them Jack Gruner did experience, but a few he did not. So in order for us to learn more about the Holocaust and the Nazis and what the Jews went through, Alan Gratz added in some different things, which technically it's not a biography anymore. Once he does that, it's just based on their life story, but it's pretty close. The dedication page for Jack, who survived. And there's all your different chapters. And the book is separated into parts and years. So it has a setting and a cluster of years each of these parts are titled. So we start off with the Krakow Ghetto, 1939 to 1942. Chapter 1. If I had known what the next 6 years of my life were going to be like, I would have eaten more. I wouldn't have complained about brushing my teeth or taking a bath or going to bed at 8 o'clock every night. I would have played more, laughed more. I would have hugged my parents and told them that I loved them. But I was 10 years old, and I had no idea of the nightmare that was to come. None of us did. It was the beginning of September, and we all sat around the big table in the dining room of my family's flat on Krakow Street, eating and drinking and talking. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, and me, Jacob, although everybody called me by my Polish name, Yannick. The Jews must disappear from Europe. That's what Hitler said, Uncle Moshe said, reaching for another pastry. I don't know how much more clear he could be. I shivered. I'd heard Hitler, the German Führer, give speeches on the radio. Führer meant leader in German. It was what the Germans called their president now. Hitler was always talking about the Jewish menace and how Germany and the rest of Europe should be Jew-free. I was a Jew, and I lived in Europe, and I didn't want to disappear. I loved my house and my city. The British and the French have already declared war on him, my father said. Soon, the Americans will join them. They won't let Germany roll all over Europe. He's already annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, said Uncle Abraham. And now he invades Poland. And guys, when he says annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, what that means is these countries joined Germany without Germany having to fire a single shot. They just kind of joined him. But Poland, he had to invade. My father sipped his coffee. Mark my words. This war won't last more than 6 months. My uncle argued with him that he was my father, so I believed him. Enough politics, my mother said. She got up to clear the table, and my aunts helped her. Yannick, why don't you put on a show for us? He built his own projector. I ran to my room to get it. It wasn't a film projector like the one in a movie theater. It was a slide projector I'd made by mounting a light bulb on a piece of wood and positioning wooden plates with lenses from a magnifying glass in front of it. I could show pictures on the wall or shadow puppet shows. My cousins helped me hang a white sheet in the doorway of the sitting room. And when everyone was seated, I plugged the projector and clicked on the radio. I like to have musical accompaniment, like a movie soundtrack. When the radio warmed up, I found a Count Basie song that was perfect, and I started my show. Using cardboard cutouts of cowboys, Indians, stagecoaches, and horses, I glued to sticks, I projected a shadow show about a sheriff in an American Wild West who had to protect his town from bandits. John Wayne Westerns were my favorite films, and I took all the best parts of his movies and made them one big story. My family laughed and cheered and called out to the characters like they were real. They loved my shows, and I loved putting them on for them. I was never prouder than when I got my father to laugh. Maybe one day I would go to America and work in the movies. Aunt Gisela would often ruffle my wavy hair and say, "You look like a movie star, Yannick, with your dark blonde hair and big eyes." I was just getting to the part where the bandit leader robbed the town bank and was squaring off for a shootout with a hero when the music on the radio stopped mid-song. At first, I thought the radio's vacuum tube had blown, but then a man's voice came on the radio. Guys, back then, radios had these tubes inside of them, and it was sort of like, it would remind you a little bit like a fluorescent light in the ceiling. When you go and turn it on, how it kind of comes on a little bit slow. It doesn't get to its full brightness till it's been on for a little while, for a few seconds. The radio tubes were like that, only they took more than a few seconds. When you turned your radio on, it would kind of make this squirrely sound. I don't know how to describe. I'll try to find it to show it to you later, but it would have to warm up, and that's what he's talking about. And this man's voice has come on and interrupted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this broadcast with the news that the German army has reached Krakow." "No," my father said. "So soon?" Uncle Mo said. "It's only been 6 days. Where is the Polish army?" I came out from behind the sheet in the doorway to listen, while the radio announcer talked about Polish forces withdrawing to Lodz and Warsaw. There was a big boom, and my mother's teacups rattled in their saucers. My cousins and I ran to the window to look outside. Dark smoke curled into the sky over the rooftops of Podgorski, our neighborhood. Someone cried out on the next street, and the church bells of Wobble Cathedral rang out in alarm. It was too late. The Germans were here. If I had only known then what I know now, I would have run. I wouldn't have stopped to pack a bag or say goodbye to my friends or to even unplug my projector. None of us would have. We would have run from the woods outside of town and never looked back. But we didn't. We just sat there in my family's flat, listening to the radio and watching the sky over Krakow turn black as the Germans came to kill us. Okay, so we know that the setting of the first part of the book that I was telling you about from 1939 to 1942 was Krakow, Poland. And so we know that setting is the time and the place that a story usually occurs. And authors usually establish the setting early in the novel. We talked about this before when we talked about plot. The exposition of the story exposes the setting, the characters, and the problem. So that's the part of the story we're in now. For chapter 1, he says something pretty interesting. He says, If I'd known what the next 6 years of my life were going to be like, I would have eaten more. And this kind of has some pictures of some vegetables and fruits, but it also has bread, which you'll hear about them eating a lot of bread. And there's a little bit of ham there, but you don't hear a lot about them eating a lot of meat once the Holocaust takes off. The point of view that the book's told from is the perspective in this case. It's the perspective from which the story is told, or the narrator's position in the description of the event. So you'll hear a lot of I, me, us, we, because the main character, Yannick, is telling the story from his perspective. So it says B-3087 is told from first person point of view. The narrator uses the word I to tell the story. There's some foreshadowing that goes on, and foreshadowing, if you don't remember, here's a review, is a hint at future events. So predict what the opening sentence of the novel foreshadows when he says, if I'd known what the next 6 years of my life were going to be like, I would have eaten more. So we know through the research, the background building that we've done so far, is there wasn't a lot of food for the Jews because the Nazis withheld it from them. So they went hungry a lot, and a lot of them died from starvation and malnourishment. This is a recent photograph of an apartment building on Krakow Street in Krakow, Poland. It is a real street in the Polish city of Krakow, and the building that Yannick lived in was very similar to this one. Do you notice that the roof is flat? It has some chimneys on top of it, but it's a flat roof. And whenever he talks about where he lives, he will call it a flat. Our flat that we lived in. A flat is a European word for apartment. So instead of them saying the apartment where we live, they'll say the flat where I lived. And I don't know where that came from. I don't know if that came from the idea that there was a flat roof on it. But I know in Europe, it doesn't matter whether they have flat roofs or not. If it's an apartment, it's called a flat. All right, let's talk about his name. His name in Jewish, or in the Semitic language, is Jacob, and it's spelled with a K, which looks a little bit different than the English translation. And when you look up some of these different places and words that are translated, they'll use different letters when they translate it into English. Like, for example, the k sound that's made in Jacob, sometimes you'll see represented as a K, and sometimes you'll see represented as a C, because the languages are different. Now in English, Jacob is spelled with a C, but the Jewish translation of it, it's a K. The protagonist, or the main character, the good guy, identifies with his Polish name rather than his Jewish name. So instead of calling himself Jacob, he calls himself Yannick. It's important to understand that Polish refers to the nationality. He was from Poland. Remember, we talked about this yesterday in the testimonies. A lot of people put their country and pride for their country and patriotism in front of their religion. The Jews did. I'm assuming it would have been true for every citizen, but since we're hearing from the Jews and people with testimony that were Jewish, that's the only stand I could take. Jewish is a religious or a cultural description, not racial. We talked about that. There is no such thing as having Jewish blood. I could become a Jew if I wanted to start following that religion. You could. Anybody could. It says, what does Yannick's name choice reveal about him and his family? And we already said this, because his Polish name is Yannick, and that's what he goes by. They put being Polish in front of or ahead of the importance of being Jewish when it comes to pride and national pride. And our Yannick has curly hair that's kind of a dark blonde, and he has blue eyes. He does not look Jewish. Here's a little bit of information about Adolf Hitler. It says he was a Nazi leader of Germany who hated Jews and sent 6 million to their deaths. Jews in Europe had suffered discrimination since the Middle Ages because of their religion, because the religion was not Christianity. The Nazis claimed Jews were a race that was inferior and needed to be destroyed. And here's a real picture of Adolf Hitler. And he's got a quote here. It says, "The Jew must disappear from Europe." That's what his goal was. That's what he was going for, and he got defeated, but he almost got it done. Anti-Semitism, which you'll hear used a lot, the meaning of that is hostility or discriminations against Jews. So racism against Jewish people is called anti-Semitism, because Semitic is the word for Jewish people. Hitler blamed the Jews for everything, including the loss of World War I, and he said the Jews were trying to take over the world. The truth was that Hitler was actively taking over other countries in his quest for Aryan global domination. So he wanted that blonde, blue-eyed, pure race to dominate the world. He was in power from 1933 until his death in 1945. Here's the radio that Yannick was listening to and I was talking to you about. Here's how it would have looked. Here's the inside. And it talked about the tubes warming up above, vacuum tubes installed in the back of the radio. So you can see this is what the inside of an old-fashioned radio would have looked like. There were vacuum tubes in there. And it says, this is the vacuum tubes for the radio. They would plug in. And breaking news was delivered by radio. Every home had a radio for news, music, and entertainment. And in 1939, it says, how did people feel? How did people get the news? If they didn't have TV, if they didn't have computers, no internet or Wi-Fi, no smartphones, how did they get the news? Well, you're right. They got it through listening to the radio, newspapers, mostly. And when you went to the movie theater, how we'll go to the movie theater and there'll be previews of new movies coming up playing. Well, during this time, since there was no such thing as television, you would go into the movie theater, and when they play the reviews for us now or advertise this to go out and get snacks, this was when they would have a news clip come up. It would be like the nightly news, but it would be on the movie screen. All right, and you all are learning about Judaism in social studies, so I'm not going to go over this too much. When they talk about the Torah scrolls, this is something like what they're talking about. This is the Star of David. They have another name for it that I can't pronounce a lot of these words, but this is the Star of David. That is their symbol. Like for Christians, their religious symbol would be the cross. The Star of David is a religious symbol for the Jews. Now, it is not the pentagram. It has 6 points. The pentagram is a star usually associated with Satanism. It has 5 points, but it's not like this one. This one has 6. So it's like a right side up triangle interlocked with an upside down triangle to make it. But it's a 3,500-year-old religion that began with the Hebrew people in the Middle East. They worshipped only one God. The story of Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, is told in the Torah, or the Old Testament. So this is the scroll that we're talking about. Moses, who received 10 commandments, is the most important person in Judaism, while Jesus is the central figure in Christianity. Being Jewish is more than following a religion. It's also an ethnicity. So I think this is where people believe it's a racial thing, because culture, it's just like in Christianity, part of our culture is to celebrate Christmas and the birth of Christ. And you'll see nativity scenes and people sing Christmas carols like Silent Night and Away in a Manger. With Judaism, they would celebrate Hanukkah. That's their cultural background, the types of foods they eat, the sayings that they have, whether you practice your religion or not. The religion influences your culture, same way it does in Christianity. It says, according to traditional Jewish law, a Jew is anyone born of at least one Jewish parent or someone who is converted to the religion of Judaism. So you can have both parents be Jewish, but if just one parent is Jewish, then you're born that way. You're born as a Jew, or can be considered a Jew. And somebody like myself, like I said, who has no Jewish parents and grandparents, I am a Christian, but I could convert and become a Jew if I wanted to. That's why it's not a race. And here's part of the map. This is Europe, and it kind of shows you how the Nazis started moving, and it shows you where they kind of started in the edge of Germany on this side, and then they moved kind of outward from there. Austria was one of the first places they annexed, and then they kind of expanded over here. Remember, all of this would have been Germany, but they lost a bunch of their land because of the World War II. And they were angry about it. And here's Poland, the country right next to it. And here's the border that limits their ability to grow. Here's the old-fashioned newspaper that talks about what we're getting ready to talk about. It says, after 1.5 million German soldiers, 2,000 airplanes, and 2,500 tanks invade Poland on September the 1st, 1939, the British told Hitler to retreat or else. Hitler ignored England's warning. 2 days later, on September the 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. So here's the slide projector he was talking about. He was showing his family shows. It was a slide projector that I'd made, remember, doing by mounting a light bulb on a piece of wood and positioning the wood so plates so that the lenses of the magnifying glass will magnify what's on the screen, which in this case, his case was a sheet hanging in a doorway. So the light's shining through the image, and then there's the magnifying glass. The slide is on there. And then if somebody had Mario on the slide, then that's what shows over there. Then he talked about John Wayne. Here's an old picture of John Wayne. I know some of you know who he is and some of you don't, but he was a 20th century American movie star who made 84 Westerns. Westerns were as popular in the 1930s and 40s as superhero movies are today. And Western culture influenced a lot of other countries. So the movies that we watched and things that we did, the soldiers came in and carried those traditions to other countries. And so some people liked Western ideas. On the radio, he was talking about Count Basie playing on the radio. And it's showing one of his albums from that era, 39 to 40. Says Count Basie was a famous American jazz pianist, band leader, and composer. He led the Count Basie Orchestra for almost 50 years. So he led an orchestra. So it's that big band sound in there. It says for months, Poland expected Germany's attack. The plan was to withstand initial attack while England and France jumped in to help. England and France did declare war, but they didn't mobilize quickly enough to stop the invasion. Poland was surrounded on three sides by aggressive German forces. Lodz fell, as did Krakow and Warsaw. Within 17 days, German forces had taken full control of Poland. And here's German bombers, a picture of them flying over Poland. It's kind of scary to look at, I think. Here's the Pogorski neighborhood where Yannick lived. Krakow would be like the county, I guess. And Pogorski would be like if you lived in Maeslick or Old Washington or downtown, that would be the neighborhood. The church of the bells of Wobble Cathedral rang out an alarm. Here's the Wobble Cathedral. The coronation site of the Polish monarchs, Wobble Cathedral, is more than 900 years old. During the occupation of Poland, the German governor appointed by Hitler established his headquarters in the cathedral. It was so fancy. So he kind of went in and took it over as his home. All right. All right, you guys. Whoa, chapter 2. The German soldiers filled the streets of Krakow. They marched in their smart gray uniforms with their legs locked straight and thrown out in front of them, the way ducks walk. It was silly, but eerie at the same time. There were so many of them, all marching in time together, their shiny green helmets and polished black jackboots glinting in the sun. Each of the soldiers wore a greatcoat, which is like an outside coat, and a pack on his back, and they carried rifles over their shoulders with bayonets at their sides. I felt small in my little blue woolen jacket and pants and my simple brown cap. There were tanks too, Panzers, they called them, great rumbling things with treads that clanked and cannons that swiveled on the top. We came out to watch, all of us, men, women, and children, Poles, which is what they call Polish people, and Jews. We stood on the street corners and watched the Germans march through our city. Not all of Poland had fallen, the radio told us. Warsaw still held out, as did Brecht, Sidlitz, and Lodz. But the Germans were our masters now, until our allies, the British and the French, arrived to drive them out. The Nazis won't be so bad, an old Polish woman on the sidewalk next to me said as I watched them. I remember the Germans from the World War. They were very nice people. But of course, she could say that. She wasn't a Jew. For weeks, we tried to live our lives as though nothing had changed, as though an invading army hadn't conquered us. I went to school every day. My father and uncles and cousins still went to work, and my mother still went to the store. But things were changing. At school, the Polish boys wouldn't play soccer with me anymore, and no Poles or Germans bought shoes from my father's store. Food became scarce too, and more expensive. Then one morning, I walked to school, and it was canceled. For good, I was told. No school for Jews. The other children celebrated, but I was disappointed. I love to read, any and all books, but especially books about America and books about doctors and medicine. I wandered the streets, watching the German soldiers and their tanks, the bread lines that stretched around the block. Winter was coming, and the men and women in line held their coats tight around them and stamped their feet to stay warm. When I went home at lunchtime, my father was there, which surprised me. He usually ate lunch at work. Uncle Moshe was with him at the table. My mother came out of the kitchen and worried over me. Are you sick, Yannick? She put a hand to my forehead. Why are you home early from school? It closed, I told her, feeling depressed. Closed for Jews. You see, Uncle Moshe said. He turned to my father, looking worked up. First, they close the schools. Next, it will be your shoe store, my fur shop. And why not? No one will buy from us with Nazi soldiers telling people, don't buy from Jews. But if they close the shoe store, how will you make money? I asked my father. Jews are not to make money, Moshe said. We have ration cards now for food with J's all over them. J for Jew. This will pass, my father said. They'll crack down for a time, and then things will get easier again. It's always the same. We just have to keep our heads down. Yes, Moshe said. He tapped the open newspaper between him and my father. Jews must keep their heads down and not look Germans in the face. We can't speak unless spoken to. We can't walk on the main streets of our own city. We can't use the parks or the swimming pools or the libraries or the cinema. Jews couldn't go to the movie theaters? No. I love the movies and the library too. Where would I get books to read if I wasn't allowed to go to school either? I hurried to Moshe's side to see what he was talking about. There, in the paper, were new rules for the Jews. My heart sank. It was true. No more parks, no more libraries, no more movie theaters. And there was to be a nightly curfew for all the Jews, young and old. We were to be in our houses and off the streets by 9:00 p.m. And armbands with the Star of David on them, Uncle Moshe said. They are marking us, branding us like the cattle in those American pictures Yannick likes so much. Next, they'll be taking all of our money. Mina, tell your husband. What would you have us do, Moshe? My mother said, putting her hand on my father's shoulders. We haven't the money to leave, and if we did, where would we go? My father reached up to hold my mother's hand. We must not lose faith, Moshe. See how easy it is to keep your faith when the Nazis take it away, along with everything else, Moshe told him. My father smiled. Let them take everything. They cannot take who we are. I sat down at the table to eat. My mother brought out a small tureen of tomato soup. Guys, that's like a big pot. A loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. So little, I asked. It's the rationing. The groceries are all closed, said Mother. So the grocery stores were closed except when they said they could be open. We'll make do, my father said. We were spoiled before anyway. I hadn't felt spoiled, but I didn't say anything. I just wished the Germans hadn't taken my lunch. Late that night, long after curfew, cries of fire woke us. I ran from my bedroom, frightened. What is it? I cried when I saw my parents in the living room. Is our building on fire? What do we do? No, Father said. It's the synagogue. The synagogue was a place where we worshiped every Sabbath and where I was studying for my bar mitzvah. I leaned out the window and saw it down on the street, engulfed in flames. My father hurried to put his coat on over his pajamas to go and help out put out the fire. But a loud crack from the street brought me and my parents to the window again. Another man wearing a coat and pajamas like my father lay dead in the middle of the street. A pool of darkness spreading beneath him, glinting in the streetlights. A German officer stood over him, his pistol still aimed at the dead man. Jews are to remain reminded that under the new rules, anyone caught outside their homes after curfew will be shot on sight, the officer yelled. My father stood in the sitting room, his eyes on the door. My mother put a hand on his chest and then her head to his. Something unspoken communication passed between them. And in a few moments, my father took off his coat again and sent me back to bed. Okay, let's talk about some of the things that they talked about in chapter 2. The kind of marching in unison that Yannick describes the German soldiers doing when they marched through the streets of Krakow when they first invaded. Yannick describes it's called Goose Stepping. It may have been a way to help brainwash people into following the Nazis. It's made it seem powerful, but look how high they're lifting their legs and in unison. They take left, right, left to a new level. Now these soldiers that they're showing in this picture do not have the outer coats on. They don't have the bayonets. They may be on the end of the gun. I don't know, but a bayonet is like a knife. I know some of you guys that play video games that are war-based know what a bayonet is, but sometimes they were put on the end of the gun so you could use your gun as a spear or sort of like a sword, but more like a spear. They said theirs were hanging at their sides. So here's kind of what it would have involved, the uniform. There's a field jacket. There's the steel helmet to protect your head from bullets. A camouflage tent. The gray trousers, which would have been your pants. Where are they? Over here. There's a leather belt that you would have worn right here. There's the anti-mustard gas cloth, which would have been this to cover your whole body up with, I'm going to assume. They had a gas mask inside this canister. They had, here I see, let me look for different things. They had a grenade, which this was a type of grenade. They had ammo pouches right here to keep their bullets in and different things. They had the aluminum, their canteen that they kept water in. It was made out of aluminum. They had the jack boots he was talking about. He was talking about black ones. These look a little brown in this picture, but I'm fairly sure they're black. They just look brownish. A rifle, of course, and the bayonet right here, which would go on the end of your rifle to use it as a spear, like I said. And they also had something interesting, I thought, which was a pair of wire cutters. And it would have been in this pouch here. And the German soldiers wear great coats and jack boots with black backpacks and rifles. So these are dressed the way Yannick described them. You can see them kind of in black and white. So they're doing their walking in unison. They got their long coats on and their backpacks. It must have been fairly cold. And he was talking about his little blue coat and pants and his cap. People wear uniforms for easy recognition to identify with a group. Uniforms are symbols. And think about what different types of uniforms represent. And let's look at the different uniforms we'll talk about a little in this novel. Jack said, I felt small in my little blue woolen jacket and pants and simple brown cap. Well, this is obviously black and white, but this would have been the type of style. He would have had a brown hat and blue coat and pants. And it says Yannick may be describing his school uniform. The boy on the left from the 1930s, and the boys above are wearing modern versions of the same outfit. So this was kind of like a school uniform, and these are modern versions of school uniforms. These are the Panzers, and they called them Panzers, I don't know why, but the great rumbling things with treads that clanked and cannons that swiveled on top. So you'll hear more about the Panzers. The treads clanked because they were steel and driving on a road, and they weren't built to drive on a blacktop road. They will actually destroy a blacktop road. It says not all of Poland had fallen, the radio told us. Warsaw still held out, as did Brecht, Slidlich, and Łódź. But the Germans were like our masters now. So the cities resisting the German invasion fell within a matter of days. Hitler's goal was to obliterate Poland. He wanted to do away with Poland. And here's the flags of the Allies. When they talk about Allied forces, of course, America hadn't joined at this point in time, but at some point we do. So you've got the Soviet Union, who was somewhat of as they have always been, a tricky ally. And then there's the United States. United Kingdom would be England, and there's French. That's the Allies. The Axis powers were the Third Reich, which was the Nazis, the German army as Nazis, Italy, and Japan. They call them the Japanese Empire. This is an ally is a state of cooperating with another for military or other purpose. So they're allies for a reason. Maybe they don't agree on things, but militarily they do. Axis is an imaginary line in which a body rotates. An Italian dictator called a pact with Germany, an axis around which all European states, animated by the desire for peace, may collaborate, which is how they got the name. The United States joined the Allies after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Initially, the Soviet Union and the Third Reich supported each other. They were allies. And Germany declared war against the Soviet Union in 1941. So Russia, which was called the Soviet Union then, didn't even fight with us until 1941. They had been palled up with the Germans. The Polish lady standing out there that said the Germans weren't so bad. They were nice in the Great War. So this is what you're talking about, World War I, from 1914 to 1918. They called it the Great War, but then it became World War I. It was also called the War to End All Wars. And it was also called somewhere the War of Nations. So somebody's got it all done. And then over here, the human cost. 9 million soldiers dead, 7 million civilians dead, 50 to 100 million related deaths, genocide, and flu pandemic. The cause, Europe had divided into two camps. The Allies consisted of the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Russia, and later the USA. The Central Powers or Axis powers were Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. In August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, keeping its promise to stick up for Belgium. Britain declared war on Germany, and the World War I began. Okay, so the bread lines were where there was not enough food, and people had to stand in line and wait for food. Like you'd have to stand in line at the checkout counter, only there's no guarantee that once you got up there would be anything left. The ration cards that Uncle Moshe was talking about were in many countries during wartime when food was limited. A ration means a limit. Each coupon was worth a certain amount of butter, flour, eggs, etc. So people would stand in long lines for hours hoping to buy food. And it says, notice the J on the ration cards. Do you see this is a bottom corner of a ration card? Has the Nazi symbol on it. It has a J, but it has somebody's name. This is the Jew that used this card. And if you look over here, there are the punches where they punch out with a hole punch when you go to the store what you've gotten. So once your holes are punched out, you're going to go hungry. All right, here's a picture of the Poles. It says no Poles or Germans bought shoes from my father's store. So Yannick was talking about that. And then if you look here, the Germans have signs, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews. So they would go out and stand in front of Jewish stores and convince people out of fear, mostly, not to buy from them. All right. Okay, here's the charts. The Nuremberg Laws were the Nazi Party's attack on German civil rights. So if you were a German, you didn't have any. If you were a Jew, they took away your rights through the Nuremberg Laws. And here's a list of them. More than 2,000 anti-Semitic, remember that's racism against Jews, anti-Semitic laws were passed at national and state and municipal levels. The Jews were no longer permitted to serve as officers in the government. They were banned from working as tax agents or advisors, so they couldn't be tax CPAs. They were banned from working as veterinarians. Jewish teachers are no longer permitted to work in government schools, so no more public schools. Municipal authorities in Berlin exclude Jewish children from state schools. Jews are no longer permitted to change their surname or use an alias. So when I married my husband, my surname was Vickers. And when I married my husband, it became Thomas. That's your surname, your last name. But they weren't allowed to change that. They didn't want them hiding the fact they were Jewish. Jews were banned from working as auctioneers. They were prohibited from owning guns or trading weapons. They were banned from health spas and resorts. They had to, Jews must add either Israel or Sarah to their names. So I would have put Donita, Thomas, Sarah to show clearly that I was a Jew. Jewish doctors prohibited by law from treating non-Jewish patients. Jews are prohibited from moving freely around Germany. Jews no longer allowed to keep or use carrier pigeons. That's how they got messages from one to one another. They had no telephone. They had definitely no cell phone. They had no way to communicate with other people, but they used these pigeons to send messages by. They were no longer permitted to own a car or hold a driver's license. All Jewish academics, lecturers, students, doctors, anybody who was considered intelligent or would cause trouble that way were sent. We weren't allowed to do it anymore. We weren't allowed to own cars. Jews are ordered to surrender precious metals and gemstones. So if you have any gold or silver or jewelry, they have to turn it over. Jews are forbidden from buying lottery tickets or claiming prizes. Jews are no longer allowed to install, maintain, or use telephones. So basically, they're isolating them. Here's the Jewish patch that had to be sewn onto people. Local Nazi governments began requiring Jews to wear identifying badges. They varied in size and color. There was no universal agreement of what the six-pointed Star of David means. It first appeared in the 17th century in Europe. Armbands for the Star of David for the Jews. So you see he's wearing a white one with a blue star outline. A lot of us have different ones. But yeah, they're at first, the Star of David would represent King David, I would think. And then he was talking about branding. They said they were branding us like cattle in those American movies. Remember, they give cattle brands because they roam out on the prairie in the West. And if they get mixed up with somebody else's cattle, that brand on them is how you tell they belong to you. A simile is a comparison using like or as. So he's making a simile. The irony of Uncle Moshe's statement is that armbands are only the beginning. Watch for more ways the Jews are branded like cattle. Okay, so the synagogue is a building where Jews meet for worship and instruction, like they learn their Jewish traditions and learn about the Jewish religion, the young kids. The Nazis closed all the synagogues, stole the valuables because they had any gold or silver things in there. Temple synagogue that was pictured here was not destroyed because the Nazis used it as a stable. The synagogue was not Yonix, but it was nearby. So they actually put their horses and things up in the synagogue. The synagogue was a place where we worshiped every Sabbath, which is what they call their Sunday, basically, where we would go to church, and where I was studying for my bar mitzvah. So we'll talk about a bar mitzvah is a celebration when a Jewish boy turns 13, they have a celebration, and then he's considered a man. For a girl, it's called a bat mitzvah. Chapter 3, I was 12 years old when the wall began, so he's lived in there like two years under Nazi rule. Pogorsky, our neighborhood, was being walled up from Zatsky Square to the Pogorsky Market and down along Lasati Place. The Nazis were walling us in. I went out to see it. It was nearly 3 meters tall, which would be about 9 feet, a little less than 9 feet or a little more, I don't know, and made of brick. At the top, it had rounded caps, like the tops of tombstones. And I'll find a picture where still part of it still exists and show you later. The wall stretched from one building corner to another, right across the street, cutting us off from the rest of Krakow. In the buildings that were part of the wall, they bricked up the windows and no doors so you could escape. There were only 3 ways to get in: a gate at Zatsky Square, another at the market, and another at Lwowska Street. I ran from gate to gate to gate, taking it all in. Pogorsky was now the Jewish ghetto. All the Poles who weren't Jews had to move out, and all the Jews who lived inside the ghetto in Krakow had to move in. I watched the moving in, wave after wave of them, huge groups of Jews climbing out of trucks and going down Lwowska Street. There were men and women and children, families, teenagers, grandparents. They all wore Star of David armbands like us. Some of them wore uniforms of the jobs they had to do: policemen, postmen, nurses, trolley conductors. There were no jobs for Jews anymore. No jobs besides cleaning the toilets of German soldiers. My father and uncle had lost their shops, had their inventory seized by the Nazis, just as Uncle Moshe said they would. The new Jews carried their luggage with them, everything they owned in the world, and they looked around with big, worried eyes at the buildings and streets of their new home. They were probably hoping that things would be better here than wherever it was they came from, but everything that had happened over the last year had taught us that things always got worse. There were a few empty flats left by the departing Poles, but not nearly enough for all the new people. My parents came out onto the street and invited a family to come live with us, the Laskys, a family of 3, with a 7-year-old boy named Aaron. We gave them my bedroom, and I slept in the sitting room. Other families did the same. Then, as the days went by, more and more Jews poured into the ghetto, not just from Krakow now, but from the villages and towns outside the city. We took in a second family, the Rosenblums, and a third, the Brotmans. The Germans even made it a rule: every flat must hold at least 4 families. I no longer had my own bedroom, nor did my parents. The children had one room, and the adults were divided between my parents' bedroom and the sitting room. Only the kitchen was shared by all. There were 14 of us in a flat that had been cozy for 3. All I ever wanted to do was get out of the house and go play with my friends. It was far too crowded at home, but my parents wouldn't let me go outside for fear I'd be taken up in a work gang. Anytime the Germans had work to be done, like scrubbing toilets or helping build the wall, they grabbed Jews off the street to do it. Father was taken all the time, sometimes mother. The Nazis even took people out of the ghetto to work elsewhere in Krakow. Sometimes they never returned. This will all be over by summer, my father told us. We'll just have to make it do until then. He was my father, and I wanted to believe him, but I wasn't so sure anymore. It was January 1941. The Germans ruled Krakow. I was 12 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had begun to doubt my father. All right, he's talking about the wall beginning. So they built the ghetto. He said he was 12 years old, so it's been a little over a year. In chapter 3, the wall put up by the Nazis to cage in the Jews. And here's Zatsky Square, what he's talking about. The 3 gates that he was talking about, there's one there, the one over there, and then the one there. Here's the street Yannick lives on, Krakow Street. There's Lwowska Street. And there's the wall. So this black band shows the map of the wall. And there was also gates that allowed the trolley, the streetcar, if you will, to pass right through the middle, because they didn't move those tracks. And the Polish people still used the public transportation, the streetcar. So they would, when the streetcar came, they would open the gate, let it go through, close the gate, obviously, and so on. So there were people who traveled to work every day right through the center of the ghetto. The Nazis created walled Jewish ghettos in thousands of cities. And of course, they forced the Jewish work gangs to build them. The Nazis didn't build them. And here's one fancy gate. Originally, the word ghetto specifically meant an area of the city where Jews were restricted by force. So if you look, the Jewish guys are building this wall around Yannick's neighborhood. And remember, he said the tops looked like tombstones. So that's a picture of them actually constructing it. Some of this doesn't stand any longer. But as I said, there's still a small piece that they left as a memorial over there that we'll try to find. Here's pictures of the Jews moving into the ghetto. Remember I told you they moved out of their houses. They had to leave everything that they couldn't carry. Their furniture, if you had grandma's bedroom suit, it got left. If you had Papa's truck that you were going to drive when you turned 16, nope, you left it. Your car, everything. Your PlayStation, your TV. Of course, they didn't have that, but you would have moved off and left everything. And as days went by, more and more Jews poured into the ghetto, not just from Krakow now, but from the villages and towns in the nearby cities. So they're coming from everywhere. And they have to think about bringing the things that they need. And this is showing the inside of a flat. So this would have been a bedroom. And here's part of the bedroom. Here's another part. Here's a bathroom and a shower. Here's some more of the interior of the flat. This one would be the dining area. This might have been another version of that. And this would have been like maybe where they did laundry. It looks like there's a washing machine there, but it's in the kitchen because there's the microwave I see. So a lot of the modern day Europeans have their washing machine inside, and they don't use a dryer. They hang their stuff up most of the time. This is a typical flatter apartment in Krakow, like Yannick lived in. It's 2 bedrooms and has 530 square feet. It has been updated. You can't imagine 14 people living there, I know. It's a little tiny place. Chapter 4. I'd always thought it would be fun to have a brother or sister. That is, until I spent a few months living in my little apartment with 5 other kids. Remember, there were 4 families living there, including Yannick's. The bickering, the fighting, the whining. You'd think that soldiers in the streets and synagogues burning and days with nothing more to eat than moldy potatoes would be more important than who got to play with the doll or who got to sleep at the window. But you'd be wrong. The nights were the worst. I pulled my pillow and blanket out into the hall whenever the Rosenblum girls were arguing, which seemed all the time now. I had to sleep on the floor, but I didn't mind so much. I would be sleeping on the floor here and there. At the least for now, I had the whole hall to myself. If we had to take in another family, I thought bitterly, I'd probably have to share the hallway too. I was sound asleep one night when a creak in the wall woke me up. In the hall, woke me up. In the darkness, I saw a shape of a person. "Who's there?" I asked, feeling my heart come up in my throat. "Shh, Yannick, it's me," my father whispered. "I'm sorry I woke you. Go back to sleep." Father had his coat on. He was going outside. "Where are you going?" I asked him. "I want to go with you." "No, it's dangerous to be out after curfew." "Then why are you going?" I was scared. I scrambled out from under my blanket. Are you going to leave the ghetto?" "Anyone caught trying to escape the ghetto was shot on sight." No, go back to sleep, Yannick." "No, I want to help." My father had begun to look so tired lately. The work gangs and the lack of food made him look like he'd aged 10 years in 2. "I can help be your eyes, to look out for guards. I want to come with you." "Shh, Yannick, you'll wake everyone else." My father sighed. "All right, but not another word. We must be silent, you understand?" I nodded and hurried to put on my coat. When I was ready, we slipped out the door and down the stairs. I had never been out this late before. The stairwell was dark and full of shadows. My heart still leaped at every little sound, even with my father there. My father led me down the stairs like we were going to the building's furnace in the basement, but instead we went out through the back door into the alley behind our building. Snow fell in big, thick flakes, muffling everything. It was so quiet. You could hear the flakes hitting the snow that had already fallen on the ground. I I followed my father through the silent alley. Our footprints left tracks in untrodden snow. I looked behind me, suddenly worried that we were leaving a trail that would be easy to follow, but the falling snow was already covering our tracks. I prayed for more of it, even though more would mean new work details for my father and other Jewish men to clear it in the morning. We had to cross Josvinska Street, which meant we'd be out in the open. Down the block, a German soldier in a greatcoat, scarf, and a hat cupped his hand to his face to light a cigarette. My father put a hand to my chest, and we flattened ourselves against the wall in the shadow of an apartment building. I watched the German soldier breathe out a long cloud of smoke. The red ember of his cigarette glowed in the darkness. Where was he from? What was his name? Did he have a family, children like me? Did he hate Jews the way Hitler did? Had he ever killed a man? The Nazi rubbed his hands together, stomped his feet to clear the snow and cold from them, and walked around the corner out of my sight. Now, my father whispered, and we hurried across the street, our feet crunching so loudly in the quiet night air, I thought everyone on the block must hear us. I'd crossed the street 100 times, 1,000 times, but it had never felt so wide as to the other side, so far away. When we reached the alley across the street, we stopped, leaning against the wall again while we caught our breaths and listened to see if anyone had heard us. The only sound was the falling of the snow. Tick, 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 tick. My father led me a short way on and I began to realize where we were going. Uncle Abraham's bakery. The Nazis had let him keep it to bake bread for the soldiers. As we pushed on the door to go inside, something caught. A towel was stuffed into a crack along the floor. As soon as we were inside, I understood why. Oh, bread. The wonderful, beautiful smell of bread. The aroma alone made my stomach growl. I had learned to live with hunger, but now that my body knew there was fresh baked bread to be had, it could barely contain itself. I shook with anticipation. My father replaced the towel under the door, and we made our way down the dark corridor to the ovens. Uncle Abraham and Aunt Phila had covered every window and door with towels, sheets, blankets, anything that would block out the light and the smell. Oscar, Uncle Abraham said to my dad when we found them. He hugged my father, and I ran to where Aunt Phila was pulling racks of bread out of the oven. And I see you brought a helper, Aunt Phila said. Hello, Yannick, she smiled at me. But I only had eyes for the bread. Golden brown loaves that glistened and steamed in the cool air. I felt my mouth water. Phila laughed. Take one. After we work, my father said, and my heart burst. How could I possibly wait? He turned to my uncle. What can we do? Are you firing both ovens? My father asked. Only one for bread, Uncle Abraham said. He opened the second oven to show it was empty. In this one, we're burning wet wood to help cover up the smell of the bread with the smoke. We weren't able to save enough flour to bake in both the ovens all the time anyway. We must make it last. Another month, another 2, another year. Spring, my father said. The British and the French will be here by then. Uncle Abraham shrugged. It may be the Russians get here first. The peace can't last. 17 days after Germany had invaded Poland from the west, the Soviet Union had invaded from the east. Poland was split right down the middle, and the Germans and Russians had promised not to fight each other, for now. In the meantime, we'll bake when we can. But if the Nazis find out, come, let's go to it, my father said. Yannick and I will feed the fires. We worked into the wee hours of the morning, father and I feeding wood and coal into the ovens. Uncle Abraham making dough, Aunt Phila pulling those delectable loaves from the racks and putting them in sacks. We must get you back before light, Uncle Abraham said at last. Here, take 3 sacks apiece. That should be enough to sell on Krakow Street, plus 1 sack for yourself. A whole sack of bread just for us? I almost moaned at the thought of such a wonderful treat. Moshe is coming by tomorrow to pick up sacks to sell to the families on Wagierska Street, Abraham said, and Dawid and Salah tomorrow night to sell to Krakow Street. How about per loaf? How much per loaf? My father asked. Abraham shrugged. 5 zloty, perhaps. 5 zloty? A loaf of bread usually costs no more than half a zloty. I hate to be so mercenary, which means taking advantage of the war. But the price of flour has gone up too. You can still buy flour, Father said. There are boys who have already found holes in the wall, ways to get out. They can buy things on the other side for a price, Aunt Villa said. These new Jews, they've brought more money too. They can afford it, Abraham said. Now, go before it's light. Enjoy your bread, Yannick, Aunt Villa said. She kissed my forehead, and Abraham and my father hugged each other goodbye. When we left, it was still dark outside and still snowing. There would be more patrols, and the ghetto would soon be waking. There was no time to waste. Once more then, Yannick said. Once more then, Yannick, go to home, and then we shall have fresh bread for breakfast. How does that sound? Delicious, I said. Father put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed it. We just have to survive the winter, Yannick, and then everything will be better, you'll see. I was still worried that he was wrong, but fresh bread made me forget my troubles, for a little while at least. All right, you guys, in chapter 4, he talks about walking in the snow. Untrodden means never been stepped in. So it'd be the snow here that's never had steps in it. So he talks about worrying about his footprints, leaving tracks where they could tell. The untrodden snow means it never been walked in before. And so they would be able to tell that they were out and about when they shouldn't be. Yannick's family, Oscar was his dad, who owns a shoe store. Mina was his mom. Uncle Abraham and Aunt Fila, they own a bakery. Uncle Moshe and Aunt Gisela, he owns a fur shop. Zitka, my cousin, his cousin, Moshe and it's got an R in it. It should say Gisela. There's no R in it. It's daughter. So Zitka is Moshe and Gisela's daughter. Dawid is Yannick's male cousin, and Sala is Yannick's female cousin. These characters are named in later chapters, some of them. There are 2 also unnamed younger cousins that we don't talk about. So here's people baking bread. Moshe will sell the bread on Wagierska Street. Dawid and Sala will sell it on Rakaka Street. And we'll look back and find those streets on the map on slide 30. So there's just Vinska Street. There's Wagierska. There's, I can't even say that word, Rakaka. There's Krakuska, where he lives, obviously. So there you go. All right. 17 days after Germany had invaded Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. So this is showing how this is Poland, how it was divided in half. This is the Soviet Union is what we used to call Russians. This is the Russians coming in from the east and the Soviets. Here's the zloty he was talking about. U.S. money system is based on dollars. Poland uses the zloty. These coins and the banknote would be familiar to Yannick. 5 zloty. The 5 zloty loaf of bread, which is 10 times its prior price, would translate into about $13.50 in today's dollar. So they were paying $13.50 for 1 loaf of bread. So this would be the paper zloty, and this would be the coins. I hate to be so mercenary, but for the price of flour was what Uncle Abraham said. Remember, I told you mercenary means concerned with making money at the expense of ethics. That means doing it against what you know is right. All right, and that's the end of chapter 4. So we've left them there.